I'm here to introduce Alice Greczyn. Alice is this year's Freethought Heroine. Alice has appeared in many movies and TV series to include The Dukes of Hazzard, Lincoln Heights, The Lying Game, The Young and the Restless, Sex Drive, Fat Albert, and Shrooms. She was raised in the Midwest. Shout out to Illinois for I talked to her yesterday about that. So Alice's nomadic childhood moved her around the country until her modeling career turned into an acting career in Hollywood. She's now the author of Wayward, a memoir of spiritual warfare and sexual purity, which tells her own story involving a painful but rewarding transition from evangelical Christianity to atheism. We do have copies of Wayward available for sale, and Alice will be signing copies of the book at the conclusion of this morning's program, along with Elle in the back. At the conclusion of Alice's acceptance speech, we should have ample time for Q&A. A reminder, if you are mobile, there are floor mics, I believe. I'm not sure with the new setup if there are, but we will make sure you get a microphone either way. Alice tells us that she loves hiking, traveling, and the relentless pursuit of knowledge. After her traumatic experience escaping religion, which she will be talking about, Alice started the group Dare to Doubt, a resource for people who are leaving harmful belief systems. On behalf of FFRF, we thank you, Alice, for your candor, your activism, and providing a resource for those who dare to doubt. Alice, please come up and accept your award.
Thank you. Thank you so very much to Annie, Lori, and Dan, and to the Freedom from Religion Foundation for this very, very special honor. I'm here to tell you what free thought means to me. But before I do that, I'd like to make a confession. I sometimes feel like a bad atheist. Like I'm supposed to be a humanist, but I'm really a nihilist. Like I'm expected to be a Democrat, but I'm really a libertarian. Like I'm supposed to shun all things that might be spiritual, but I'm really intrigued by the possibility of consciousness in trees and what we call near-death experiences. I grew up in a strain of Christianity that taught me there was only one way to think, one good way, one true way, one right way. I memorized Bible verses like the one that said, "Lean not on your own understanding," and another which said, "The heart is deceitful above all things." From a young age, I learned that my mind was dangerous and that my desires were sinful. My obedient nature compelled me to conform to ideology rather than challenge it, at least too much. Questions were always welcome, as long as one was willing to receive and accept the right answers. Because the hunger of my rational mind wasn't easily satisfied, I learned it was best to keep my doubts and ideas in a prison of my own making, and my thoughts felt anything but free. The particular strain of Christianity that shaped me is tricky to pinpoint because my family and I did not consider ourselves religious. We called ourselves non-denominational, but I knew from magazines that my mom kept in the bathroom that Christian media outlets considered my family charismatic. I wouldn't know until I was an adult that the secular media would have considered us evangelical, or worse, fundamentalist. All I knew as a homeschooled child was that our lives were led by what God told people. If God put something on someone's heart, like giving my dad a job, it happened. When God put on my dad's heart to give away his job, it happened. Eventually, God put on my parents' hearts to remain jobless, to sell our house, and to live in campgrounds across North America indefinitely. We called it living by faith. The secular media would have called us homeless. God never put anything on my heart. For reasons I didn't know, reasons I blamed myself for, God never spoke to me. So my life was governed by what he told others. When God told a pastor that secular music was evil, I broke my favorite CDs. When God told a friend to call me out for wearing shorts, I repented and put on a long skirt. When God told a guy from my youth group that I was his future wife, our parents affirmed God's will and I was betrothed to marry him. I was 17 years old. God did not tell me about this betrothal. Instead, he told the man who was to be my future husband, and this was not uncommon in our world. What was uncommon was that I didn't love him. He was just a friend, and I was just a girl, so it made sense that God would tell him and not me. As a female, it was my duty to submit to the headship of a man, and my conditioning was such that I did so unquestioningly. I wanted to cry at the thought of marrying him. But I was so accustomed to obeying God's will that I didn't even question what people said God's will was anymore. So I lied about how happy I was to my fiancé, my parents, and myself. My betrothal at 17 was the pinnacle of my mind's imprisonment. By that point in my life, I had trained myself to suppress my own thoughts and heed the thoughts of others. I'd learned to trade the desires of my heart for the desires of the hearts around me, and to replace my ideas with the ideas of others, and to repent for thoughts that didn't align with what I was told God wanted. If God wanted me to marry a man I didn't love, so be it. But somewhere inside me was a woman on the verge of setting herself free. I eventually found the courage to break off my betrothal. It was the hardest thing I've ever done, and remains so to this day. I didn't know it then, but ending my betrothal began the end of my faith. It's a long story, and I did write a book about it, if you're interested. But what I feel is important to share with you now is how I came to be a free thinker. I moved to Los Angeles by myself at the age of 17 to pursue acting. I believed with all my heart that God was calling me to the mission field of Hollywood. And to say that my Christian values were shaken upon moving to LA would be nothing short of an understatement. I didn't know where to look when men held hands. I had to practice saying fuck in my shower because an audition required it of me, and the word wouldn't get comfortable in my mouth. My first kiss happened in acting class when my teacher assigned me and a boy the roles of Laura and Jim from The Glass Menagerie. I remember feeling sick afterward and avoiding my scene partner's eyes because I had broken my vow to save my first kiss for my wedding day. But my Christian values were shaken in good ways too, ways that at the time felt really scary. The world outside the church wasn't broken. In fact, it didn't look like anything I'd been taught it was, all lost and empty and sinful. The non-believers I met seemed happy, genuinely happy, and they were as good and moral as any Christians I'd known, maybe even more so. As the years of my late teens passed, and as my circle of friends widened, the concept of hell began weighing on me in ways that it hadn't before. None of my friends were Christians. One was, but she was having sex with her boyfriend, so she didn't count. The rest of my friends were mostly secular, while a few fell into the hell-bound brackets of Scientologist, Jewish, and gay. They were the kindest, most accepting, and most tolerant people that I'd ever met. And I sometimes felt overwhelmed by them. I felt overwhelmed by their bawdy sense of humor and their irreverence. What I never felt around them was shame. Shame fit me like a cozy sweater. If I felt shameless, I felt naked, for there must be something I wasn't repenting for. One must always be in a constant state of repentance in order to be clean in the eyes of God. And if one did not feel shame, how could one be truly repentant? I was very used to feeling shame around my church friends. I honestly don't think any of them meant to shame me, but shame was the emotion I felt when I was called into righteousness in the name of love. and to love meant to hold one another accountable. It meant to point out each other's sins so that we might be corrected. It meant policing our words and actions and even our thoughts, for thoughts, as the saying went, led to words, which led to actions. No one told me this was not always true, and so I policed my mind with a hypervigilance I've still not recovered from. The neural pathways of my brain matured under a microscope of morality that I surrendered to, for to surrender to shame meant surrender to God. My faith would not have changed without the shame-free love of my non-Christian friends. This is how I came to be a free thinker. My friends did not hold one another accountable. They did not require me to agree with them about everything or anything in order to love and accept me. My secular friends never pressured me to see things their way. They never threatened to disaffiliate from me if I said something they found problematic. They never used words like problematic or harmful or sinful. They never called me out on anything, and they never made me feel anything remotely close to shame. It was freedom from shame that led to my freedom of thought. Being around my non-Christian and secular friends who were non-judgmental, compassionate, and empathetic, friends who valued difference and diversity, friends I never saw publicly humiliate one another. Being around these individuals showed me an entirely different way of existing. The world outside the church was not only unbroken, it was whole, full of grace and laughter and love. This defied everything I'd been taught about the fleshly realm that I'd been told to fear. It was shame and fear of shame, that kept me in religion as long as I was. And I can't tell you how concerned I am to realize that had I been a 17-year-old moving to Los Angeles today, I may never have left the faith that kept my mind imprisoned. I may never have summoned the courage to break off my arranged betrothal. I may never have found secular friends who did not hold one another accountable for perceived moral sins. If I had moved to Los Angeles as a teenager today, I might have found that the non-Christian world was just as harsh and unforgiving as I'd been taught to believe. I might have experienced the secular world to be just as shame-inducing as the world of the church, but scarier, because at least Christianity offered a path to redemption when one was accused of committing a wrong. At least Christians pretended to extend grace to those accused of harmful words and actions. In large parts of the secular world today, present company excluded, and particularly in the online space, grace is not only withheld, it doesn't seem to exist. Even when someone says they're sorry and repents the ways they are demanded to, the scolding continues, with self-righteous collar-outers issuing a callous, "Do better." Christ at least said you are forgiven. I don't observe such grace in the Los Angeles that I live in today, nor in much of the America I live in today. The liberal, secular world where I once found acceptance is now where I find myself walking on eggshells, just as I did in the church. The liberal, secular world is where I now find myself censoring thoughts before they dare lead to words or actions. The liberal, secular world is where I'm now terrified to ask a question, to counter a point, or to show evidence contrary to a story we're all supposed to believe. The liberal, secular world where I once found freedom from shame is now quick to heap shame on the masses, shame so internet thunderous that it's led to people taking their own lives. In the secular world of my youth, one before social media, my friends asked gentle questions in the privacy of our hikes and dining rooms. Sometimes they challenged me, particularly on my pro-life stance and my belief in hell. When they did, I always felt their love and curiosity. When we disagreed, they did not blast our differences to the world. It was the shame-free acceptance of my friends that made me feel safe enough to have conversations that slowly, very slowly, changed my beliefs. It was their lack of accountability, their lack of calling me out, that led to my lack of fear. And this freedom to question and to share without fear or shame allowed me to ponder ideas that I would have never dared. I observe fear and shame to be the most powerful inhibitors of free thought. Together, fear and shame arrest us from empathy, from curiosity, and from the pursuits of liberty and love that give our lives meaning. When we're afraid to think, for our thoughts might lead to the words and actions that we're told are condemnable, we trap ourselves and each other in ever-increasing cycles of dogma and obedience, and no one may question whether the dogma is sound or the obedience blind. It troubles me deeply to observe cycles of fear and shame being wielded outside of the religious sphere. People are being shamed for their ignorance, their disagreement, and often for simply being misunderstood. The ones who haven't been shamed yet wait fearfully for their turn to be called out, to be canceled, to be publicly held accountable for daring to think differently and not going along with the program. I don't observe this to win hearts or change minds. And maybe some of you are thinking, but what about the very real need for accountability? I think public accountability has its time and place, especially for crimes of a violent or violating nature. But I also think there is a very real need for compassion and understanding, especially toward those we disagree with. There's a need for patience, for a long-game approach to the long-lasting goals we wish to see. It's hard to change a long-held view when the whole world is watching and just waiting for you to mess up. It's hard to make mistakes in public, and mistakes are often how we learn. I don't think it's far-fetched to say that I would not have left my faith had I moved to Los Angeles today. I don't think I would have found the grace for my ignorance or the acceptance of my difference that I found there 20 years ago. I think the non-Christian world I might have encountered as a teenager today would have pushed me right back into religion's folds, because the grace of Christianity may be based on a mythological tale, but at least there is a semblance of grace. So what free thought means to me is quite literally everything. Freedom of thought is what allowed me to claim my freedom from religion, which allowed me freedom in every aspect of my life that was once controlled by fear and shame. Free thought to me means the freedom to question and the freedom to learn. It's the freedom to seek out multiple points of view without fear of condemnation or the risk of ostracism. Free thought to me means the acceptance of diversity, including the diversity of thought, belief, and opinion. Free thought to me means the bold courage to resist peer pressure, to counter shame with grace, and to give ourselves and each other permission to change our minds with encouragement instead of righteousness. My friend Dave Warnock, who some of you may know, Dave is a gem, and if you don't know him, look him up. Dave once said that we who are secular need to be better than the church. If we hope to encourage more people to leave the church's fear-driven folds, if we hope to loosen the theocratic hold that Christianity has on our Supreme Court, on our public schools, and on our fellow citizens, if we hope to live freedom of thought by example, we must be better than the church. We must differ with respect and disagree with curiosity. We must not shun and shame each other for differences of perspective the way the church so often does. We must not hold one another accountable in public spotlights the way Christians call out one another's sins. As secular folk, we are at risk of alienating people who may very much want to leave their religions and deconvert. They're watching us, wondering what it will cost them to leave, and they're weighing whether the price is worth it. These people, like my younger self, they're afraid of losing the only community they may know, however stifling and shaming it might be. They may stay right where they are when they see non-religious communities shaming and stifling each other just as harshly. We who are secular are at risk of wielding shame without hope for forgiveness or grace or redemption, and I believe we can be better than that. I know we can. So freedom of thought to me, ultimately, means freedom from fear. And free thought to me means freedom from shame. It means sharing my ideas knowing that I'm going to be wrong sometimes, and that my mistakes will only make me wiser, especially when they're met with compassion. Freedom of thought to me means encouraging others to think freely too. It means helping them resist the shackles of fear and shame, both in and outside of religion. It means asking dangerous questions, sharing taboo thoughts, and advocating for mercy in a world that's screaming for justice. Justice is sorely needed, but we cannot forget the value of mercy too. It was the mercy of my secular friends that allowed me to flourish into the free-thinking woman you see in front of you today. This is what free thought means to me. Thank you.
We do have time for questions for Alice, so let me remind you, if you have your cell phones, please turn them off so we can hear all of that. Your book is powerful, and it's powerful because it's real. You know, it's just a beautiful story. So I don't know how we're doing questions today. Are there some microphones out there? I can't see because of the lights, but if someone's at a microphone, go ahead and step up and ask a question.
We have microphones.
Oh, great. But that's the voice of God coming from somewhere. Buzz actually was the voice of God in a book. So I guess you can hear them?
Yes,
oh, very good.
Thank you.
I'm not near a microphone, but I have a loud voice.
Okay, I can hear you.
First of all, I just want to say I read your book and loved it so much, and I feel like your speech today is the most important one we've heard. It is so prescient and important, and I just applaud you for giving it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, I appreciate that.
So I grew up in a conservative family as well, and I want to hear what you think is the best way we can reach out to those that are kind of been misled recently and are not following, I guess, the right path of skepticism and being able to recognize the reality of the world. How do we reach them, bring them out of that?
I'm a big fan of speaking primarily from my own experiences, and I think that, first of all, there's multiple approaches that are needed and that are going to be effective toward achieving the goals we all want to see, which are more inclusion, diversity, acceptance. And clearly, from my own experience, I advocate for mercy. I advocate for gentleness and for not using shame and fear as a way to coerce people into changing. And so to answer that question, I think one of the most effective ways, because if we're going about what's going to be most effective to change minds and win hearts, it's a long-range game in my book. It's being friends with people that you don't want to be friends with. It's adding them back onto Facebook. It's following them again on Twitter. It's having private conversations in intimate settings, not on the public online sphere. I think that through relationship and through empathy, we have the best odds of affecting long-lasting, genuine change, not peer pressure, oh, quick, I'll apologize and delete it and change my mind. that's motivated by fear. And I think fear and shame often have a high potential for backlash and rebellion down the road. I know I did. All that Christian fear and shame, I definitely rebelled. So yeah, it's a long-range game in my opinion. It's befriending people, and it's having soft questions and listening and asking follow-up questions and maybe offering your perspective, but certainly not with a threatening, condemning approach, which I think is very hard, especially when we're triggered, which I often am.
Hi, I know you can't really see me, and I know it wasn't really your intention, but I do appreciate everything you said there, especially the last part. I feel shame right now. I volunteer with a group called Recovering from Religion, which provides a safe, empathetic channel for people who are considering leaving their religion and don't have the kind of support that you just talked about. And I get a lot of comfort from that, and a lot of anxiety as well, because it's kind of difficult to hear some of the stories. But I also spend a lot of time on Reddit, and that's where my lesser self comes out and participates in some of the things that you mentioned. And I do try to be compassionate in some of it, where I can stand up against people who are being kind of bullies in those forums. And I guess there's not a question there, but the question I really had was that your book, I know it covers your journey, but does it also cover everything you just said at the end of your talk there about being compassionate and graceful?
No, it doesn't. It touches briefly on how it was the love of my secular friends that really did make me feel safe to have conversations about changing my mind about, traditional right-wing things. When I was a teenager, I marched on the Capitol Mall in a pro-life rally to bring America back to God. And I was so mortified when they would find out things like that. And so there are a few moments in my book where I do share just those instances of cognitive dissonance of like, why do I actually think this? Where is the love in my beliefs? If it's about love and God is love, where is God and love in what I'm saying? So there's definitely moments that speak to my own personal experience coming out of a very fundamentalist mindset. But no, I don't explicitly talk about the parallels between what some might call cancel culture and I would equate to a Christian accountability group. I could write a book about it, but it's not explicitly in the one that I've already written this time. This one's more my personal story, and then from there, maybe I will use it as a springboard to write about these other topics. And Pete, please don't feel shame.
Hi, I have a question for you, actually only about one word that you used quite a few times. And I'm a native-born American. My English is pretty fluent, but I am totally clueless about the meaning of the word grace that you used quite a few times. And maybe it's because I don't come out of a Christian tradition, and there are definitions that are there. I've heard explanations of state of grace and other terminology, but I must confess that whenever that word was used in your description of an environment or a supportive group, that one word was a puzzlement to me. So I'm hoping you can expound a little bit on what you meant by that. Thank you.
Yes, I appreciate that question. I'm a big, words mean a lot to me, and I think that you'll probably find a lot of different definitions for grace in different dictionaries. My background, like I said, is Christianity, and so when I use this word, I'm coming at it from a more Christian usage. And I've often said before that I would love for us secular folk to appropriate grace from religion, because I do see it's something that religion does really well, and why a lot of people are drawn to it in the first place. What I mean when I use the word grace is ultimately it's a soft acceptance. It's a warm forgiveness. It's a willingness to cover up someone else's sins or moral transgressions. It's a willingness to say you're in a social setting and someone makes a racist joke. It means maybe not calling them out on that right away in front of everyone. It means maybe brushing it off, changing the subject, and then alone, when you're one-on-one, being like, hey, I know you really didn't mean for it to be this way. I know you're a really good person and that you care. But I have to say, it kind of landed a little hurtful when you said this. That's a way of practicing grace, in my opinion, in the ways that I'm talking about it. I know there's been a lot of pressure lately to call out people in real time and to take a stand. And again, I think there's multiple good ways that we all can approach, and I think we should all use the ways that are most authentic to us. But I chose to focus on secular grace because, again, that's just what spoke to my experience and what I see being very effective when I've practiced it. And so grace, it's doing what you can to cover someone's ignorance. It's doing what you can to cover someone's blunder and their mistake and their foolishness. It's being kind and not humiliating them and forgiving. And when they do say they're sorry, oh man, I messed up. I'm sorry, that's on me. It's not being yeah, do better. It's thank you. Moving on. It's not throwing increasing heaps of humiliation and self-righteousness at them. I think that's probably the best way I can answer what that word means to me right now in this context.
Thank you for your talk. You mentioned the influence of the internet and, quote, social, or I prefer to call it asocial media.
I'm right there with you.
Can you address that? How do we deal with that? What do we do about that? How did you see it destroy the community that helped you come out? And I've seen this in my community too. How do we deal with that? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I first became aware that things were shifting. I became aware of my own triggers, I guess I should say. My own buttons being pushed around the mid-20-teens. When I started seeing people being piled on to issue apologies for things that, to my perspective and certainly to theirs, did not look like they were intended with harm. Now, that doesn't mean that harm can't be caused inadvertently, and it doesn't mean that it shouldn't be addressed. It's the ways that we address it that I am personally speaking up about. So I notice when people online dogpile on someone who's said something problematic, for instance, or has shown liked a comedy special. We've seen it everywhere from people who like Dave Chappelle's comedy special, which was called Transphobic, or when we see someone who likes a certain podcast that maybe they shouldn't be listening to, or when someone wears a Halloween costume that maybe they shouldn't be wearing. I remember it was around the mid-20-teens that I started seeing whoa, this is, I don't think these people who are quick to take down their picture and issue apologies, I question how authentic their change is going to be, because it cannot feel good to have the whole world blasting you and saying how wrong and evil you are and labeling you all these things. And even, like I said, to me the most dismaying part of public accountability is even when a person does be like, yeah, man, I fucked up, I'm sorry, that was so wrong of me. It gets worse often. It's like, yeah, you're wrong, it gets shared. So I think ways that we online can try to combat that, don't participate. Even if you think what someone's done is heinous and deeply offensive, try to resist the urge to add to the dog pile on them in the public sphere. Maybe reach out to them privately. I've done this when I've seen friends get canceled. I've gotten canceled. And I've had friends reach out to me, and it was the private messages of hey, I see what's happening online. I see what you're going through. I'm here if you'd like to talk. It's interesting to me that the spaces that claim to be the most safe, I often feel the most scared in. And I know I'm not alone in that. I've talked with so many people who have gone through this, and you know, there's all these terms, and the terms keep changing in terms of what we're allowed to use. Some people don't like the term cancel culture anymore. It's accountability culture. I think that's a semantics game that is not as important to me as what they have in common. And so in the online space, I think when we see that happening, don't participate. Try to seek out multiple sides of a story. Reach out to the people involved. If it's something that you really care to educate yourself on and learn, don't just believe everything you hear or see. Reach out and try to learn from multiple perspectives, and give the canceled person, if you can, and I understand we're all different. Maybe this person's cancellation is not one you can offer gentleness and grace to, but if you can, let them know you're here, you care, you want to listen to their perspective. Let them know that there's at least one person out there who's not coming at them with such harsh condemnation. And we might be surprised at how much more quickly some of these problematic people may come around, instead of doubling down and getting defensive and making it worse, which is what I often see happening.
Wow, I think I'm more baffled than ever on this. My experience was totally the opposite. I was an atheist from a little bitty kid, and I was alone. I had no community, so this just never happened to me. Do you know where it came from, how it started?
Oh man,
maybe you've answered it.
No, you know, I think a lot of things started with the internet and with social media. I think a lot of things started with the maturing of my millennial generation, and certainly Generation Z. I think I wouldn't be able to say exactly where it started, and I'm sure there's tons of sociologists who probably can speak to this much more educatedly than I can. But I know I first observed it. I was just talking about this with a friend, actually. I first observed these hints that we were going in this direction. I believe it was 2014 or 15 when the musician Pharrell was photographed on the cover of a magazine wearing a Native American headdress. And Alice in 2022 was like, oh my God, like how could he? What was he thinking? Alice in 2014 was like, I genuinely did not understand the term appropriation. I didn't understand what he'd done wrong. I was looking at it like, oh, I thought it was a beautiful celebration of an admiration of another person's culture. And since that time, because that's been, 8 years ago, I have taken the time to educate myself on why a lot of things like that are done with the intent of honoring or admiring or even showcasing can end up having a really hurtful effect on the communities feeling appropriated. But I remember the way that from there, I kind of saw a lot of things snowball, and certainly, Trump, Me Too, so many things in our social fabric seemed to happen so quickly and overnight, and they built such momentum, and people got such a sense of identity on being on the right side of history, which is a very natural human inclination. And I think as a lot of people have left religion, which is great, one thing that religion offers very well is a sense of identity and purpose and righteousness and being on the right side of things. And I think that, while obviously a lot of social justice issues are far more valid than faith-based ideological ones, sometimes I've observed a blurry crossover in the ways that we practice trying to change people's minds about things and trying to get people on our team. Again, I share the same goals and values as many people who may practice what might be called cancel culture. It's the methods and the ways that I most object to. And again, I know there's going to be a different method that speaks to everyone, and I'm not trying to change anyone's approach. I only ask that we'd be willing to consider that mercy is getting lost in this, and so is grace. I hope that answers that question.
Hello. I'd like to know how large your social community is, where you found it, and if you have the need to make that community smaller.
Let's see. I'm not on Facebook anymore. I made one TikTok and I decided I didn't like it. I was like, this isn't for me. On Twitter, I have about 25,000 followers, I think, and on Instagram, I have somewhere around 40,000 followers. I do sometimes feel the need to make it smaller, and I do that if I want to make it smaller, I have to do is post something a little bit controversial, and a bunch of people unfollow me. And so I like to do that periodically to weed them out, to be like, like if you can't handle this, like I listen to Joe Rogan, guys, and apparently that is damnable. And every time I post something about his show, I lose a bunch of people, and I get a bunch of angry people being like, "You're platforming this, that, and the other thing," and it's like, okay, bye, thank you. So my social media following does shrink, and I'm happy about it because I don't want people who bully in my space. I've been very open before about your choice to follow me is optional. I'm not a publicly elected figure. I'm not forcing anyone to follow me. So if you choose to be here, please do so knowing that I'm not going to take responsibility for your feelings. This is not a safe space. This is me sharing me, and if you don't like it, you may move on. And of course, followers are social currency. They open up doors, especially as an actress. Producers care about how many followers you have when they're hiring, and I've been an outspoken atheist now for 3 years. And I get asked sometimes, like Julia Sweeney was asked last night, how being in Hollywood and being an outspoken atheist may have affected her career. And I always say, I don't really know. As she said, Hollywood is very anti-religious, but deeply spiritual. It's very spiritual, very woo, and it's difficult for me sometimes, but so far, I just reached a point where I just don't care. There's more important things that I personally care about, and I've gotten way more opportunities that I never would have dreamed, like being here with you fine folk, so it's a lot more gratifying. This is the only award I've ever won, and it's great. I mean, I won most cheerful at summer camp, but...
Good morning. Overall, I consider myself a fairly nice person, but I can tell by listening to you that you're a much nicer person than I'll ever be. But I'm a lot older than you, too. So, I have a two-part question. The first part is, have you ever run into Kirk Cameron in Hollywood?
No,
and if you were offered a role by the God's Not Dead franchise, would you accept it?
By the what franchise?
God's Not Dead movies.
God's Not, oh, you know what? I actually know a producer for there who a while ago, before I was open, did want me, and I was like, no. Don't think you want me on your press tour. No, I've not met Kirk Cameron, and I have not, I don't think I would be a part of that particular franchise. Although, I would be a part of a certain Christian film, like if they remade the movie Saved, that would be really fun to be a part of. And partly because I know the audience that they're most likely going to draw, I could maybe get a little word in edgewise with, but I would have to be careful about that. So I wouldn't say no across the board, but it would be on a case-by-case basis whether I'd be involved in a Christian production. I did play an Amish girl once. That was really fun. She was on her Rumspringa, so I got to be crazy.
Hi, Alice.
Hi.
I just wanted to say I just checked Twitter and you're canceled. So.
I believe it.
No. Seriously, I do have a question. I just want to know, do you see many of your peers in Los Angeles leaving for places like Austin or other places due to cancel culture? I know you mentioned Joe Rogan and he moved to Austin, but is that happening with your peers as well?
I would say yes. I think that might just be one possibly subconscious motive. I know in the pandemic, A lot of my friends are gone. They moved to places like Austin and Nashville. I've considered those places myself. And yes, I think, speaking for my own personal motives, part of me would like to be in a blue city within a red state, because I think people who live in blue cities within red states have a lot more practice with tolerance. Their neighbor has a Trump sign, you have a Biden sign, and we're all taking out the trash. And I think that in Los Angeles, it is such a very blue bubble that I observe very little tolerance, in the name of tolerance, which just baffles me. But I do think that could possibly be a driving reason. I know it is, actually. I can think of a few people. One's moving to Phoenix, who have expressed, like, I just can't be here anymore, whether it's the vaccine mandates, whether it's cancel culture, whether it's just feeling like an alien in the city that used to be welcoming to outcasts, the city that used to be welcoming to artists is now slicing art right and left. And it no longer feels like a safe place to create. It feels like a safe place to conform and to be a part of the propaganda. But that's my opinion, and I think that there are a lot of people there who don't conform, but were quiet, because the cost of not being quiet is certainly deadly to a career, and often one's social fabric. So yeah, I do think a lot of people are probably leaving for that, as well as cheaper rent. LA rent is so much right now, guys.
Cool. Thank you.
All right. That's going to end the Q&A, so let's give a big hand again. Alice.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.